Why am I back here defending Tolkien again? I could have sworn I just did this. I had a whole funny opening last time and everything. And I'd do another silly opening this time, but CBR just doesn't feel worth that much effort. Yeah, so CBR's back with another article about the 10 ways Lord of the Rings hasn't aged well, and I have no idea how to make this one unique. Well, Hannah did draw like an elf clayer at one point. Let's use that as the avatar this time. There we go. That's different. All right. Hey, Kafirimar. Let's do this. 10 ways Lord of the Rings has aged poorly. Despite being a significant benchmark in fantasy epics... 10 ways Lord of the Rings has aged poorly. Despite being a significant benchmark in fantasy epics, The Lord of the Rings hasn't entirely stood the test of time, by CBR staff, published October 20th, 2022. The Lord of the Rings by J.R.R. Tolkien is largely responsible for modern fantasy. Tolkien's idea to make a fairy story written for and read by adults proved to be incredibly popular, and his work continues to live on today. However, like many books that came out in the 1950s, some elements of Tolkien's work haven't aged particularly well. A book having outdated elements doesn't necessarily mean that that's a bad thing. Just because certain elements of The Lord of the Rings have fallen out of fashion in contemporary literature doesn't mean that they can't still be enjoyed. However, some parts of the book have aged poorly because they are problematic and offensive in ways that went uncorrected at the time. It fascinates me that CBR can contradict itself in the exact same paragraph. You see, his works continue to live on today, written here, but then you follow that sentence immediately with, they haven't aged well. I'm sorry, are they still popular and beloved today, or are they not doing well? I'm confused by this. Usually when you say the line hasn't aged well, that means most audiences today don't like it anymore. So I feel like it's aged fine, but we'll see. Number 10. Tolkien's writing features plot cul-de-sacs for the sake of world building. Tolkien's Middle-earth is one of the most meticulously crafted fantasy settings in existence. Apart from The Lord of the Rings, he details the history of Middle-earth in the Silmarillion, and had tons of personal notes on the world. While this makes for an incredibly rich setting, it occasionally resulted in clunky storytelling. When the main four hobbits take an unplanned detour through the Old Forest and meet the strange Tom Bombadil, readers are treated to many pages about a character who will soon disappear from the plot. While this establishes more about the world of Middle-earth, modern audiences are used to very streamlined stories and expect every chapter of a book to advance the main plot. Oh, Tom Bombadil, you were a merry fellow. Bright blue was your jacket and your boots were yellow. Those who only watch the movies probably have no idea who Tom Bombadil is. He was a character created far before The Lord of the Rings were written. Tolkien claimed that he created this chipper and mysterious fellow as a reference to his children's Dutch dolls, though scholars recently have tried for years to find other inspirations for the character. In the Lord of the Rings books, Tom rescues Pippin and Merry from Old Man Willow and lets the four hobbits stay in his home for 2 nights. He's actually quite a unique character, as he was able to see Frodo even when he was invisible, was able to wear the ring without any impact on him, and seemed only mildly interested in it, not at all corrupted by it. Some scholars have attempted to point out that Bombadil might be some kind of opposite to Sauron, like Sauron sought domination of Middle-earth through the Rings of Power, and Bombadil refers to himself as the Master and has no interest in the Rings of Power. He's already someone who's in control, but doesn't bask in domination. He's unaffected by the Ring of Power to the point that even Elrond recommends that Tom keep it. Gandalf advises against that, though, saying that because Tom has no interest in it, he'd probably misplace it somewhere, and that's not a good situation either. In many ways, Tom Bombadil is a very strange character, open to a lot of interpretation. Now, Tolkien himself said that Tom Bombadil was, quote, just an invention, not an important person to the narrative. Even if you represent something that I feel is important, though I would not be prepared to analyze the feeling precisely. I would not, however, have left him in if he did not have some kind of function, end quote. So in Tolkien's own words, he basically said that he added him not because Tom's important, but because Tolkien thought that he would fit into the story, and he's a character that Tolkien had already created. And while he's not a crucial part of the story per se, he still plays a role. Tolkien also adds that nothing will be gained by trying to overanalyze him. Specifically, he says that Tom is not improved by philosophizing about him. In other words, to put it in the most simple terms, don't read too deeply into Tom Bombadil. Now, in response to your issue, you think the problem here is that modern audiences expect every character to play a large role, and they don't like how Tom is introduced only to not have any purpose on the main plot. Well, for one thing, I don't really think that's the case. Background characters and side characters come and go often. I mean, I could bring up a few examples like Rose Tico, maybe, but that's beside the point. Also, it's important to recognize that while Tolkien was telling a story, he was telling it within a world he was building. For him, it was less about the narrative being pushed by all the elements, but the world giving birth to an adventure. Sometimes elements and characters of that world will play out minor or passing roles. And that's the nature of our reality, too. We meet people in passing. We experience temporary and fleeting relationships. Sometimes they mean a great deal, other times they're easily looked over. And in the case of Tom Bombadil, this is just one such experience. But seeing as there are people who want a dedicated Tom Bombadil movie, and please, for the love of Eru Iluvatar, I beg you not to. If Rings of Power proved anything, it's that you're all completely incapable of replicating Tolkien's talent. But because people do want it, I don't think fans were disappointed in his existence. So, sorry. Number 9. Random characters show up for a short amount of time in The Lord of the Rings. The Silmarillion and some of Tolkien's other writings, which were compiled into the history of Middle-earth, cover a lot of the world's history. Some characters from these writings, notably the elf Glorfindel, make small appearances in The Lord of the Rings, but don't influence the plot too much before leaving. Tolkien fans love these cameos, but many modern readers are left frustrated by them. Readers of contemporary fantasy like A Song of Ice and Fire are used to characters sticking around and making surprising contributions to the overall plot. Though this element of Tolkien's writing may have aged poorly in novel form, having cameos from random characters does seem to be taking off in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Wait, isn't this exactly the same criticism you just made about Tom Bombadil? Only the last one was specifically about Tom, and this one is just more general? Let me guess, your first 5 or 6 criticisms, like your top 5 at the bottom, were your only real criticisms. But you still had to get 5 or 4 more out there, so you fabricated some, and now you're just repeating yourself, am I right? So I feel I don't even need to say anything else. I feel my counterpoints from the previous issue still hold true. But before I move on, I like that little nod to George R.R. Martin you threw in. Look, it's not a good idea to compare Martin to Tolkien. Tolkien wrote about a world and its history. Martin wrote about political and royal drama. Martin was invested in writing a story of rulers and competing families and lands. Tolkien was creating a world that spawned an incredible adventure. Both are stellar creators in their own right, but both approach their fantasy in different ways. Oh, and let's not talk about what contemporary audiences prefer, shall we? The contemporary audience could look at shit smeared on a canvas and call it bold and provocative. When modern movies and show creators constantly claim, we want to make stories for a modern audience, do they constantly turn out quality content or crap? I think it's really not a good idea to assume that quality is dependent on the contemporary. After all, what Tolkien wrote is timeless. Perhaps it should be treated as such. Number 8. Tolkien's heroes seem invincible. The Lord of the Rings largely centers on war, and they are written by a war veteran. Considering these facts, it's strange that none of the main characters die. Fans of the film adaptations might argue Boromir, but in the books he was a very shallow character, simply meant to show audiences the effect of the ring. Of course, a character doesn't have to die to be affected by war. Tolkien himself knew that very well. However, modern audiences have the perception that characters dying and other dark elements make a work of fiction more realistic. Some readers may feel that a story where all the main heroes survive is outdated based on what they have come to expect from newer books. Alright, so you want something more realistic. Fair enough, I'll grant you that. Good point. So why were your first 2 points about how every character introduced has to make a big meaningful impact on the story? Because that's not realistic. You want realism when it suits you. While yes, I grant you that death is sparse in The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings books when it comes to many main named characters, although I would argue you left out a few, like maybe in The Hobbit, wink wink, Thorin Oakenshield, just saying. I don't think it hurts the story, nor does it really bother that many people. I mean, you hand-wave away Boromir as a shallow character, but by your logic, he did serve a purpose. He did leave an impact. His death had consequences later in the trilogy in Gondor. I mean, and then you're also leaving out others, like, Denethor. That was a big one. Then, of course, there's King Theoden, and I already mentioned Thorin Oakenshield. These are characters, right? But fine. I guess I'll grant that not a lot of the lead characters die in the overall story of The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. Okay, but with that said, I hardly think that means any of it aged poorly, but okay, sure. Number 7. Some of the Lord of the Rings main characters lack agency. Contemporary readers like their principal characters to have agency in their story, and characters who don't are often maligned. A good example might be Twilight's Bella Swan, who many readers dislike due to her passive role in the narrative. No, that's not why we didn't like Bella. It's because she was a Mary Sue and incredibly annoying, but moving on. In The Two Towers, Merry and Pippin are largely passive characters. They begin the book captured by a pack of orcs and stay that way until the Rohirrim kill the orcs and allow Merry and Pippin to escape with little effort. Later, they become passive observers of the Ent's destruction of Isengard. Even the team behind the Two Towers film adaptation thought that modern audiences would be unhappy with this depiction of the hobbits and updated their story to make them a bit more involved. I seem to recall in the books Merry taking an active role in wanting to ride to Minas Tirith with the Rohirrim. I also recall Pippin and Merry both taking part in the War for the Shire at the end of the Return of the King books, and part of their story was that they began as mostly helpless, always having to be saved from their problems, but in the end, learn how to take charge and action and no longer become helpless in everything they do. What do you mean some characters have no agency? What do you mean by that? I mean, you mentioned the last march of the Ents. Merry and Pippin did, in fact, encourage the Ents to act. The difference was that in the movie, the Ents had to be tricked because during the Entmont, they decided not to do anything. In the book, though, they did. I think you're reaching for a problem that's not there. Number 6, the story takes a while to get started. A lot of modern media, books included, are very concerned with hooking audiences as quickly as possible. In an oversaturated landscape of fiction, it makes sense that books need to do everything they can to prevent readers from putting them down and moving on to the next one. Because the Lord of the Rings books were published in a very different setting, they do not have the same sense of urgency. For audiences who are used to fantasy stories that start during an exciting action scene, or else at the book's climax before flashing back, the Fellowship of the Ring's opening will likely feel quaint and outdated. Were it to be published today, readers might not make it through the somewhat dry explanation of what a hobbit is before deciding they'd rather read a Brandon Sanderson book that starts with a magic-fueled assassination instead. You know what? You know what? I will actually grant you that criticism. Oh, not that The Lord of the Rings is aging poorly due to it having a slow start. No. I just agree that most modern audiences have the attention span of a gnat. People today seem incapable of watching any amount of footage for longer than 20 minutes unless some kind of action explosion or sexy imagery is on display. The audiences of today have absolutely no patience anymore. But that's not the sign of a bad story. That's a sign of an audience that has grown too used to immediate gratification. In this case, I'd say it's not Lord of the Rings aging poorly, but audiences forgetting priorities in terms of absorbing media and stories. Number 5, the Lord of the Rings books lack diversity. Because Tolkien was largely inspired by white European history and myths, The Lord of the Rings is not a very diverse series of books. The main cast of characters is all presumed to be white based on the books, and even adaptations of the work reflect this lack of diversity. Representation in media matters, as some studies have suggested that positive representation can lead to greater acceptance of people who are othered. Having a series of books featuring all white lead characters is a notion that feels dated with today's sensibilities. I knew we'd get here, folks. I knew this was coming. I saw it coming a mile away. All that other stuff, 10 through 6, all those other points that they made, not real issues. They probably made those up last minute so that they could get a full 10 count, right? These are the real issues they take. 5 through 1, I guarantee, these are the real problematic issues that they take with Tolkien and his work, right? This is where the real problem is. Oh my gosh. La boa vie Oreo Druin. All right. I will only concede this point if you have half the cast in the Black Panther movies be Asian, white, and Hispanic. I mean, like you said, we need diversity, people, and modern audiences demand diversity. It goes better with modern audiences, right? Also, I think that the movie Mulan needs some black and white people in it. There are way too many Asians in that. We need diversity. It is offensive and wrong, and it ages poorly that these movies do not have a diversity quota involved. Guys, those stories that I just mentioned, including Lord of the Rings, have their stories based on and inspired by real-world nations and territories with specific racial demographics. The world of Wakanda for Black Panther takes place in an African-style setting where the majority of the population is going to be black. Mulan takes place in the world of China where the demographic is going to be mostly Asian. Just like that, Tolkien took his inspiration from European folklore, myth, history, and culture, and thus it makes perfect sense that his world is going to be based around mostly white characters. I don't understand why you can't get this concept. Oh, but it's fantasy, Raven! It's not meant to be based on real-world places! Exactly, it's a fantasy world. So to that I would say, why the hell should there be real-world racial representation in it? See, it doesn't make sense from either viewpoint. If you want to argue from the perspective of, well, in the real world today, there's a lot of diversity. Not when you look at the history and culture that they're drawing from. Oh, but it's fantasy. Fine, then if it's fantasy, then why are we trying to insert real-world racial demographics? It doesn't work from either perspective. Look, anyone who came to Lord of the Rings and said, why is everyone white? Didn't go in with the right frame of mind. I didn't watch the movies or read the books and see white people. I saw men, elves, dwarves, hobbits, ents, orcs, uruks, goblins, dragons, spawns of Ungoliant, Valar, Ishtari, skin changers, and on and on and on. It's fantasy. Real-world races need not apply. If you can't accept that, then I suggest you go watch some modern Disney movies, and they will give you all the pandering your immature little heart desires. Number 4. Some races in the Lord of the Rings are inherently evil. In Lord of the Rings, there are certain races that are only represented by evil characters. The orcs, uruks, and goblins, for instance, only appear in the form of evil antagonists, leading readers to believe that all members of these races are evil. Tolkien said, nothing is evil in the beginning, which is a good sentiment. However, when every character from a race is shown to be evil, it does make readers think that every member of the race must be evil. Even if the races depicted are fantasy races, the idea that a group of people is all born with the same immutable qualities is outdated and frankly problematic. Oh, hello, extra credits! I didn't know you were dropping by for a visit. Yes, folks, you heard that right. It's the return of the argument that if all members of a race are evil, then it's problematic. Well, hate to say it, but once again, this does not connect to the real world. Real-world races are not being represented by the orcs or uruks. The orcs were elves, twisted and corrupted by Morgoth, turned into creatures that detest and hate beauty, light, and kindness. They delight in wickedness, cruelty, and they make a very easy enemy group for the good guys to fight. The only people who seem to want to compare orcs to real-world races are you idiots. As you push for, what's it going to be called now? Hashtag not all orcs movements? Which I'm sure the orcs would find highly amusing as they rip out your filthy innards and feast on your man-flesh. I'm actually looking forward to the day that we get an Orc Lives Matter movement in Gondor, aren't you? Let's get that. I'm looking forward to that. Oh, no. Orcs crump hate. Am I right? I could do this all day, but I won't, because it's stupid. There is nothing wrong with creating a de facto evil race or species in a fantasy world. They make for an easy antagonist force for the good guys to oppose without being held back by the moral quandary of, are we the bad guys? It's sad that you think this is an issue, but I have a recommendation for you. T. Talbe Orc. Number 3, the geography of Middle-earth is concerning. Some critics of Tolkien's work have pointed out some potentially concerning connections between where certain groups live in Middle-earth and real-life biases. Geographically, there is a large east versus west dynamic in the books, which is even directly referenced in the text. In the books, the good characters are from the west and the bad characters are from the east. Tolkien addresses criticism, saying it arose simply due to the narrative he was telling, but it does parallel some concerning talking points. The idea of protecting Western civilization has been used by some bad actors in support of white nationalism and xenophobia. More politically active readers of The Lord of the Rings will likely see some red flags in this similarity. Wow. You're actually bitching about the geographical location of the good guys versus the bad guys. Oh, you're actually doing this now. We're actually doing this. I'm kind of at a loss for words. I'm not gonna lie. I feel a little at a loss for words right now. Okay, well, I sure as hell hope that future evil groups and factions, both real world and made up, know that their base of operations and its location matters. It better not be in a spot that's problematic for the delicate sensibilities of today's modern groups. Oh no. Oh, can I even make fun of this? This is almost comical. I love how they even state Tolkien's response to this criticism that it simply arose due to the narrative being written and that it has no basis on any real-world parallels. Like, you brought that up but then just walked away from it. You morons are so obsessed with dragging a fictional fantasy world into the real world and making parallels. It's amazing. Here Aquile. Number 2, Tolkien's work features uncomfortable racial terminology. While possibly not intentional on Tolkien's part, there are certain words he chooses to use that, in a modern context, raise a few eyebrows. While Tolkien himself professed to be an anti-racist, and there is strong evidence to support he meant this, some of his terminologies were ill thought out and have aged poorly. A clear example of this comes in Chapter 10 of The Fellowship of the Ring, when Aragorn is discussing the Nazgul with Barlam and Butterbur. The innkeeper says that, quote, "No black man shall pass my doors while I can stand on my legs," and also refers to the Nazgul using a slur. These lines have aged very poorly and are likely to detract from the intended message of love and cooperation in the books. Oh, please, won't someone protect us from the words? How? How could a world totally unassociated with the real world, with, by your own admission, no people of dark skin tone, possibly make a statement that was so fundamentally racist against black people? It's just so unbelievable. It's not like the language of Mordor is actually called the Black Tongue. It's not like the terms dark and black have been colors associated with evil since ancient days. Oh, it's so pervasive in our common culture and movies and books. How dare Star Wars refer to the villain side as the dark side? That's offensive. How dare Harry Potter refer to evil magic as the dark or black arts? That's incredibly offensive toward black people. It's nice to know we now live in a world where literal colors are now offensive. Y'all, I've been called every white racial slur I can think of, and I haven't batted an eye. I mean, sure, it's like, really? You're gonna do that? But I don't scream and cry over it. But a character in a fictional world refers to the enemy faction as the Dark Ones or Black Ones, and you lose your shit despite the fact that it has nothing to do with their race or skin color. You know what? I'm willing to bet that you were in Spanish class and you were practicing your colors. You saw the Spanish word for black and had a heart attack. It's really pathetic. That's all I'm saying. Number 1, Tolkien's world features very few women. The Lord of the Rings is largely a story about male characters. The female characters in Tolkien's work are largely sidelined or defined by their relationships to men in the story. By today's standards, this type of storytelling doesn't really hold up. Similar to ensuring there is good representation across races, it is also important for media to portray characters of multiple genders. Though Tolkien does include some good moments for his female characters, notably Éowyn slaying the Witch King, they do not feel like fully realized people. No, the truth is it's not important. I mean, I know you said it's important, but it's really not. Look, I know what they put in modern movies and books these days, where women are the cool ones, you know? They try to subvert the idea that men are the heroes. They try to make women the heroes more often, but that's not what's important in storytelling. When Tolkien was getting inspiration for Lord of the Rings, he was getting a lot of it from European folk tales and fairy tales and stories where men were the heroes. They saved the day. And you can call that sexist if you want, but that's what he got inspiration from, and it works fine. But even with that in mind, a lot of the women in Lord of the Rings still did cool stuff. Galadriel is awesome. Éowyn is awesome. Arwen is awesome. There were a lot of good things about the female characters. I think it's weird that you discount that and just say, we need more. And you know what? That's what it really comes down to, doesn't it? That's what this whole list has come down to. The story, world, craft, languages, conflicts, and battles aren't what matter to you. They're not what's important. For you, it has to meet all the right modern checkboxes. It has to have various races, but still treat all those races equally. Every race should have the potential for good and evil. There should be zero nuance. There should be zero black and white. Everything has to be gray. Women should be just as prevalent as men, so there can be an equality of the sexes regardless of the time period. The evil faction should outsource to other races beyond one, and the evil faction better not have any color codes connected to them either, lest they be labeled as bigoted. All characters have to be major players so everyone feels included, but make sure you kill off a few of those people to get some tearjerker scenes. You know what? Fine. While we're at it, Middle-earth is too complicated. Let's base our new story in New York City. We're going to make Frodo Baggins queer. We're going to make Merry and Pippin women, because we need more women representation. Let's have Aragorn get cucked by Éowyn and Arwen. Then have Éowyn and Arwen actually have a lesbian relationship so that we can echo Legend of Korra then, can't we? Because both women decide that girl power is the best and they get rid of the guy they were both crushing on. And not only do Éowyn and Arwen defeat the Witch King, they'll also defeat Sauron too in a straight-up sword fight on the slopes of Mount Doom. That's what we need, girl power. Let's see, what else can we do? Let's have there be a good faction of orcs who turned to the good side because they were tired of Sauron referring to them as black ones when they wanted to be seen as indigenous Mordorians. You know, that sounds more progressive. Oh, and instead of Sauron ruling the Upper East Side of New York City, since that would be really inappropriate, let's have him rule Staten Island, since that's as west as you can get in New York City, and we won't run into the East versus West controversy. Oh, and the One Ring, instead of throwing it in Mount Doom, let's say that Frodo offers it to Sam as a marriage proposal. Because, again, Frodo and Sam are going to get together. We'll make Sam and Gandalf both be black. That way we'll have some black representation. And we'll replace the unique and wonderful languages of the world with hip-hop, rap, and slang. And all those wonderful poems and pieces done by the elves, like the Lament of Gandalf. No. It's all going to be mumble rap. And Frodo and Sam will have their marriage ceremony in Central Park, not a church. That would be offensive and way too Christian. Heck with Tolkien's Christian identity. That's bad. That's offensive. Let's get rid of that. Saruman will show up at the end and pull an Alex Jones about how this marriage is offensive and against everything Errol Luvatar said. And then someone will throw a pie in his face and a laugh track will play out as we get a really cheesy 80s song that plays out everything. Right, there we go. We did it. That's it. A perfect modern adaptation that will be sure to get an audience score of 8% on Rotten Tomatoes, but a critic score of 99%. It will get a huge amount of money from Disney. It'll be streamed for a few months on Disney+. It will be blasted to the ground by fans of Lord of the Rings, and then the writers and directors will come out and say that all the fans of Lord of the Rings are racist, sexist, homophobic, and xenophobic, and this is a story for a modern audience, and if you just can't get that, you're not real fans, even though they just said that all the fans are racist, sexist, homophobic, and xenophobic. But don't ask them to be consistent. It's sad that I can actually just list off all the things they'd probably do to Lord of the Rings given the chance and just know that they would push that. It's becoming comical at this point. You know, at the end of the day, Lord of the Rings is a timeless work of art. It's a testimony to the outstanding and beautiful work of a man who valued culture, history, language, and stories. He didn't just create a story, he created a world. A realm of wonder that goes beyond the films and trilogy of books that we love. I mean, people still study his work today and learn more and more about this realm and genre that he pioneered with his own mind and passion. You consider that aged poorly? No. No, see, here's what happened. What's happened is that society has changed its expectations based on what they feel is currently problematic, offensive, and traditional. Tolkien was a Christian. He compiled his stories and words based around European traditions, folklore, language, and fairy tales. But these things are seen by the thin-skinned of today as problematic, racist, bigoted, and thus they hate it. Whose fault is it, therefore? Is it Tolkien's fault for not considering the sensibilities of the future? Or is it the fault of the modern audiences for being so desperate to be offended that they will choose to be offended at literal fantasy? You know what? I think that wraps this up. I'm going to go ahead and sign off now because I got a lot better things to do than worry about what these thin-skinned morons have to say. Until we meet again, Namarie.